Week 5 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. What a start it's been for Puka Nacua the first month of the season. 20 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. It doesn't matter the matchup. Him and Stafford have been locked in since his rookie season a couple years ago as Puka Nacua. And this week in a matchup versus a beatable secondary on Thursday night with San Francisco coming to town. Once again, I think he goes out there, has a big game. Number 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So St. Brown, every season he's going out there, he's putting up numbers. This week a great matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals where Cortland Sutton just tore up this secondary. And St. Brown, once again, 80, 90 yards and a touchdown this week is definitely possible. Number 3, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Jefferson finally had a big ball game, and with Carson Wentz in there quarterback, it makes sense. He's a gunslinger. He's a quarterback that's going to take chances, get the football to his top targets, and we've seen it throughout Wentz's career. And with J.J. McCarthy, I think he needed a little bit more seasoning and even watching on the sideline. So this week, I know it's a tough matchup versus solid defense of the Cleveland Browns. Another overseas game for this Minnesota Viking team. But like I said, Jefferson and Wentz have been on the same page now. Number 4, Jackson Smith-Njigba, the Seattle Seahawks. JSN, he's been off to a monster start. I know last week was a little bit of a down game for him with 13 fantasy points. That's just how good he's been so far this season. 18 or more fantasy points, except last week versus at the Arizona Cardinals on Thursday night. So this week in a potential high-scoring game versus a leaky secondary of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Once again, JSN could be a top 5 performer. Number 5, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So maybe I'm higher on Collins than consensus. We don't know if Marlon Humphrey is going to play in this game. Their top corner over there for this Baltimore Raven team. And a lot of guys banged up. And also now with Lamar Jackson out, see Houston, they were going to have to put a lot of points on the board to keep up with that offense. But now they could stay within themselves in this ball game. We know Nico Collins, one of the better receivers in the league. And this week at a banged-up secondary of Baltimore where they don't have to rush the football down the field now to try to keep up scoring with Cooper Rush in their quarterback. I think Collins has a nice game. Number 6, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. This week a great matchup for Garrett Wilson and the New York Jets. I know the Jets, one of the worst teams in the league going for on the air, but I've said it tons of times in these videos. Garrett Wilson, it doesn't matter the quarterback. He goes out there every season, he puts up 1,000 yards. And we saw last week in Miami what a catch he made in the back of the end zone and almost had 2 touchdowns, but he got called on a offensive passing interference. But this week versus nothing secondary of the Dallas Cowboys, Wilson, once again, this week is a top option. 7, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So we knew the numbers were going to take a hit, obviously, with Joe Burrow out with the turf toe for 3 months for Ja'Marr Chase on the Cincinnati Bengal team, but we didn't know quickly they were going to take a hit. And I think they just got to pepper him with targets. This is their only chance in this ball game with Detroit coming into town, where you know Detroit's going to put up anywhere from 28 to 35 points in this one. But Chase, he's a great wide receiver. I think he can overcome it as the weeks go on, and he'll have some big games. And then some games like the dud he had last week. Number 8, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Emeka Egbuka quickly moving up the ranking, now operating as the number 1 wide receiver over there in Tampa. We know Mike Evans, he's out for a few more weeks with the hamstring injury, but Egbuka is a first-round pick. He's come right in and fit right in with Baker Mayfield. And this week in a good matchup at Seattle, where their secondary isn't all that great, even though Tyreek Woolen, to me, is one of the better corners in the league. Egbuka, once again, I think will have a good game. Number 9, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. Another wide receiver filling in number 1 spot on his team with CeeDee Lamb out a couple more weeks with the ankle injury. And last week, Pickens didn't disappoint, operating as the number 1 wide receiver versus one of the best defenses in the league in Green Bay, going for 134 yards and 2 touchdowns. So already this year, 4 touchdowns in 4 games for Pickens. And this week versus a weak Jets secondary, even though Sauce Gardner considered one of the better corners in the league, I still think Pickens gets his number. It's number 10, Davante Adams of Los Angeles Rams. Adams, he's fit right into this offense for Sean McVay and this Ram team. Him and Matthew Stafford have a great rapport. He's getting peppered with targets as well weekly as Adams. The only thing, obviously, his ceiling's capped with a Puka Nacua on the other side in the receiving room with him. But this week versus San Francisco, Davante Adams, I think he'll have another good game. Number 11, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Zay Flowers last week, a quiet game. He got some garbage time touches towards the end. And now with Cooper Rush in their quarterback, they're going to run a more traditional offense. Rush, obviously not a mobile quarterback, and he's not a game manager as well. He could go out there and make plays. We saw it the last couple of years with the Dallas Cowboys. So this week in a matchup versus Houston. I think Zay Flowers still could get some numbers in this ball game, even with rush at quarterback. Number 12, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. So Deebo taking those first team snaps as the number one majority of training camp when McLaurin held out for a new contract have paid off. And this week in a matchup at the Chargers where their secondary on paper is good, but they've still been giving up points over the last couple weeks. I think Deebo, once again this week, has a good game. 13 Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So week 2 was a bad week for him, and now the last 2 weeks, Sutton's back to form and putting up numbers. But this week, definitely a tougher matchup on paper versus one of the better secondaries in the league here, the Philadelphia Eagles. But Sutton, the number one target in this offense. He makes plays. He's got his extension in the offseason as well, and Sean Payton puts him in the right spots to make plays as well. And he's pretty much at the point of being a matchup-proof receiver. 14, Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers, a receiver that no one really looked at coming into fantasy drafts this season, was Johnson. After last year, a lot of drop passes. He was in and out of games injured as well, and his route running wasn't good. But in year 3, he's broken out as Quentin Johnston, and arguably he's the number one option in this passing game right now for this Charger team. So him and Herbert are locked in. Yards after catch, he's making big plays. And this week versus a bad secondary of Washington, he should go out there once again and put up similar numbers. 15, his teammate Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Keenan had a down game last week. The whole offense as a whole, besides Hampton, had a down week for the Chargers and the upset loss at the New York Giants. But this week with Washington coming to town and the track record of Los Angeles over the last few seasons, they're a better team at home than they are on the road. I think Keenan Allen bounces back in this one. 16, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Waddle now operating as the number one receiver. Tyreek Hill out for this season, obviously tearing that knee up. Possibility he misses time next year as well. So Waddle, the number one receiver. Good matchup this week at Carolina, where they're giving up a bunch of points over the last couple weeks here. And Jalen Waddle, he's had a couple good games this season, so now he should have elevate his play. 17, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So talk about a bounce back and a guy that was just the late round flyer pick where people needed depth on their team going into fantasy drafts. But Pittman with the quarterback change from week 1 where Daniel Jones won the training camp battle, it's paid big dividends for him. And this week in a great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders that can't stop anyone. I think Pittman, that 80, 90-yard touchdown range is a possibility again for him. 18, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Xavier Worthy last week, he came back and he had a nice ball game as Worthy. Yard after catch, we know he's got speed. This week, a good matchup at the Jacksonville Jaguars on Monday night. Their secondary, I don't really think is that good. And Xavier Worthy is the number one wide receiver in this offense until Rashee Rice returns. 19, Tetora McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. It's Tetora McMillan, a couple good games so far in the early going. But I think there's some plays left on the table where he could have some bigger games. But Bryce Young, not the ideal quarterback for Tetora McMillan. Obviously, he was going to land in a not ideal spot. A lot of teams that were bad were not good quarterbacks. But this week in a matchup versus Miami where their secondary's depleted, I think McMillan has one of his bigger weeks he'll have this season this week versus the Dolphins. 20, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So this week a tough matchup. That's number 1 with Patrick Surtain most likely shadowing him the whole ball game. And number 2, this Eagle team, they don't like throwing the football. Second half, they didn't even complete a pass last week. So A.J. Brown in week 3, we saw the monster game from him in the comeback victory versus the Rams. But this week here versus Denver, it could be tough sledding. And already this season, he had 2 games on 3 fantasy points in PPR leagues. 21, Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. Last week was a tale with 2 halves for Marvin Harrison. First half, he couldn't catch anything. Couple drop passes, interception off his hands. And then second half, he looked like a true number 1 wide receiver, making plays and scoring a touchdown. So this week, in a pretty good matchup versus the Tennessee Titans, I think Marvin Harrison could go out there and put up receiver 2 numbers. 22, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. So Pearsall banged up with a PCL injury. I know the game's tomorrow, Thursday Night Football, so we'll see if he plays in this one. But Pearsall's a tough guy, obviously. We saw last season what happened to him off the field, getting shot, and he came back a few weeks later. And this week at the Rams, if he could get through this ball game, then they get that mini bye, 10 days off in San Francisco. But this week, I think Pearsall, if he suits up, is our wide receiver 2 option. 23, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's been a down year for Brian Thomas. Last week was his best game of the year, but it's not saying much. 5 catches, 49 yards, a carry for 7 yards. This week, a tough matchup versus Kansas City, where most likely McDuffie, one of the better corners in the league, is going to cover him in this game. But someone's got to go out there and make plays for Jacksonville. It just can't be ETN weekly, and especially if they're chasing points, maybe Thomas could work his way into a decent game. 24, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave this week, he's moved up just like a few of these wide receivers with a few teams on bye. But this week, a good matchup versus the New York Giants, and we know he gets peppered with targets weekly, is Chris Olave. So this Giants secondary really can't stop anyone. Chris Olave is a good route runner. Him and Spencer Rattler have a good rapport. Even though his ceiling is capped for Olave, he's still a wide receiver that goes out there with his target share could get 12, 15 fantasy points. 25, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So it looks like Terry's going to play. He's trending in the right direction. Early reports of the week come out about Terry McLaurin, and he has to get things going. He held out all the training camp for his contract. He got his money, rightfully so, but now it's time for him to get things going for this Commander team, and Jaden Daniels most likely returning as well. So this week, in a matchup at a beatable secondary at the Chargers, he's that fringe receiver 2 flex option. 26, Jacoby Myers of Las Vegas Raiders. So last week was a bad week for this Raider offense. Geno Smith was throwing the football over the yard. The only bright spot was Ashton Jinty, who had 3 touchdowns. But besides that, Bowers didn't do much, Myers didn't do much, and Trey Tucker didn't do anything. But this week in a potential sneaky high-scoring game in Indianapolis, I think Myers could bounce back. 27, Stephon Diggs of the New England Patriots, going back to one of his former teams at the Buffalo Sunday Night Football. Diggs finally had a big game last week with the Pats, 6 catches, 101 yards in that ball game. And maybe Diggs finally got his legs on the rim after he pretty much came back in a quick timetable off an ACL, where he tore it last season, week 4, week 5, and he was back this year, week 1, playing in the opener. So this week, the juices are going to be flowing at Buffalo. Had a big game last week. And I think Diggs, he's a flex 3 receiver option. 28, Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. Another receiver banged up over there in the receiving room for San Francisco. Juwan Jennings, we know he's a talented wide receiver, but he'll have some good games and some games where he don't show up. So this week in a matchup at the Rams, where I know their secondary is suspect at times, I think Juwan Jennings could go out there if he plays, has an okay ball game. 29, Ladd McConkey of Los Angeles Rams. So Ladd McConkey quickly falling down the rankings as well. He was a second-round pick, early third, latest in most fantasy drafts going into the season. But now Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen, who returned in free agency after he was traded to the Bears last year, have taken a lot of reps and targets away from Ladd McConkey, and obviously it shows up in the box score in fantasy points. So this week versus Washington, maybe McConkey gets going, but right now to me, his ceiling just isn't that high. 30, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So with Mike Evans out, going back a couple weeks ago, Godwin in week 4 made his debut, 10 targets, didn't do much with them, but another guy who came back pretty quickly from a devastating injury last season is Godwin, and now he already played in week 4. So this week, beatable matchup with the Seattle Seahawks. Their secondary is hit or miss, even though it's going to be loud over there in the 12th man. But like I said, give Godwin a few weeks, and I think he's going to start moving up the rankings. 31, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So last week, if it wasn't for a monster play down the sidelines, where he should have really took it to the end zone, but good hustle fried the defense of the Pittsburgh Steelers to stop him, he would have had a bigger game with Jordan Addison. So him and Carson Wentz have to get on the same page and build rapport. So Carson Wentz, like I said, he's a gunslinger, but at times it gets him in trouble. We saw Jordan Addison have a solid year last year, but with him still getting his legs under him, not playing 100% of the snaps yet with Adam Thielen over there as well, and also in a tougher matchup versus Cleveland overseas. I think Addison's ceiling this week isn't that high. 32, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. Another guy whose ceiling isn't that high is Devonta Smith. This week, a tougher matchup versus the Denver Broncos. And I've said this in other videos. Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts running the football, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, they're ahead in the pecking order of priority in this offense, where right now he's that 4th, 5th option easily is Devonta Smith. So this week with a tough matchup, and if he's not catching a deep ball or making a big play, is Devonta Smith. He's pretty much a flex option at best. 33, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So he doesn't get a lot of volume and target, Shakir, but he makes the most of what he gets. And we know Josh Allen, obviously, he's that quarterback that's going to spread the football out. A lot of players are going to put up numbers and make plays for this team, and especially with James Cook, one of the better running backs in all pro football in the backfield. It's going to be tough some weeks for Shakir to have consistent production, but this week in a matchup, Sunday night with New England coming in, I still think Shakir could go out there, and he's a top 36 option. 34, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So T. Higgins, he's fallen off quickly, and this whole offense obviously has over the last 2 weeks with Joe Burrow out. Jake Browning, he's not making quick decisions. Him and Higgins missed on a couple deep balls on Monday night at the Denver Broncos, and his ceiling isn't that high. If Jamar Chase isn't producing, T. Higgins isn't going to produce much, obviously, with Jake Browning in there, quarterback, and it is a tougher matchup versus a pretty solid secondary of Detroit. 35's Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So J-Mo, he's a deep ball and nothing wide receiver. Last season, he had a monster year where Ben Johnson found creative ways to get him open and make big plays in space. But this season, we really haven't seen it, and we know Ben Johnson left and went to become the head coach for the Bears. But this week at Cincinnati, if there was a time for Williams to go out there and have a big game versus a bad secondary, this would be the week. But like I said, if he's not making big plays and he's a boom or bust wide receiver, you really can't rank him high in the 36 and final receiver rankings. Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. So Coleman, week 1, had the monster game versus Baltimore. Now the last 3 weeks, pedestrian to pretty much mid-ball games for Keon Coleman. But Coleman, I still think, has talent. Only in his second year, was a second-round pick last season with this Buffalo Bill team. And Josh Allen, we know he's that quarterback that pays attention to detail. And if you're going to, put in the hard work and go out there and practice hard, Allen's going to get you the football. But right now, like I said, after week 1, I thought Coleman finally broke out and it was going to be a big year for him. But he's a wide receiver, only putting up 5-8 fantasy points in PPR leagues the last 3 weeks. This week in a matchup versus New England, not bad on paper, but the ceiling just isn't high for Keon Coleman right now. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 5 of the fantasy football season.